Prince Andrew has reportedly bowed to pressure, agreeing to move out of the Royal Lodge.
The revelation. The envelope arrived at Buckingham Palace on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by private courier, marked for the attention of the King's private secretary with instructions that it must not be opened by anyone else. Inside was a laboratory report from one of London's most prestigious DNA testing facilities. 23 pages of genetic analysis that would unravel a secret kept for 38 years. The results were unambiguous, expressed in the clinical language of science that leaves no room for interpretation or denial. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, third child of the late Queen Elizabeth and currently eighth in line to the throne, had a daughter he'd never acknowledged. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, 37 years old, a history teacher living in Manchester, and until 6 months ago she had no idea her biological father was a member of the British royal family. The palace had known this moment was coming. Sarah's initial approach had been made through proper legal channels 3 months earlier, accompanied by family documents, photographs, and a request for DNA testing that the palace could not reasonably refuse without appearing to have something to hide. Andrew had submitted his sample under protest, convinced the claim was fraudulent, another attempt by someone seeking attention or money by inventing connections to royalty. The palace legal team had been quietly confident the results would disprove Sarah's claim, and the matter could be closed with a discreet settlement and non-disclosure agreement. Instead, the laboratory report confirmed what Sarah had suspected since discovering her late mother's diary. She was the biological daughter of a prince, conceived during a brief affair in 1986 when Andrew was 26 years old and serving in the Royal Navy. The woman who would become Sarah's mother was named Catherine Mitchell, 23 years old at the time, working as a secretary at the naval base where Andrew was stationed. The affair lasted 3 months, ending when Andrew was reassigned and Catherine discovered she was pregnant. She never told him. According to the diary entries Sarah found after her mother's demise from cancer 2 years earlier, Catherine had tried to make contact once, writing a letter to the palace that went unanswered, likely intercepted by staff trained to filter out correspondence from people claiming royal connections. Catherine had raised Sarah alone, later marrying a man who adopted Sarah and gave her his surname, never revealing the truth about her biological father. The secret died with Catherine, or would have, except she'd kept the diary, kept photographs of herself with a young naval officer whose face Sarah recognized immediately when she saw Andrew's official portraits online. King Charles received the DNA results at Clarence House that same Tuesday afternoon, reading them twice in the study where he conducts his most private business, the room where difficult decisions are made away from advisors and protocol officers. His first call was to his brother, reaching Andrew at Royal Lodge in Windsor, where he'd been living in relative seclusion since stepping back from royal duties 3 years earlier, following the scandal that had already devastated his reputation. "We need to talk," Charles said without preamble. "The DNA results came back. She's your daughter, Andrew. The science is conclusive." The silence on the other end of the line lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt longer. "That's impossible," Andrew said finally, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone who'd spent years denying uncomfortable truths. "I barely knew the woman. It was decades ago. How can they be certain?" 99.97% probability, Charles replied, reading from the report. "As close to absolute certainty as science allows. She's your daughter, which makes her my niece, and we have approximately 48 hours to decide how to handle this before her lawyers make it public." The royal family has weathered many scandals, survived many revelations that threatened to undermine the institution's carefully maintained image of stability and tradition. But illegitimate children carry particular weight in monarchies where bloodlines determine succession, and legitimacy forms the foundation of royal authority. The palace couldn't deny the science. They couldn't dismiss Sarah as another fraudulent claimant. They had to acknowledge her existence while managing the narrative to minimize damage to an institution already struggling with public perception of its relevance in modern Britain. The emergency meeting convened that evening at Buckingham Palace involved the king, his private secretary, the palace communications director, 3 lawyers specializing in family law and royal protocols, and notably absent, Prince Andrew himself. Charles had ordered his brother to remain at Royal Lodge, arguing that Andrew's presence would only complicate discussions that needed to focus on institutional protection rather than personal feelings. The lawyers outlined the options with clinical precision. Option 1. Acknowledge Sarah's biological connection to Andrew but emphasize she has no claim to titles, no place in succession, no official royal status. Option 2. Offer a private settlement in exchange for her silence, though this risked looking like a cover-up if details eventually leaked. Option 3. Embrace transparency. Issue a frank statement acknowledging the situation, and allow Sarah to make her own decisions about public engagement with her newfound heritage. What does she want? Charles asked, the first question anyone should have asked, but somehow hadn't until this moment. The lead lawyer consulted his notes. According to her representatives, she wants acknowledgement. Not money, not titles, not public role. She wants her father to admit she exists. She wants to know her half-sisters. She wants what was taken from her when her mother's letter went unanswered 37 years ago. The room absorbed this information with varying degrees of discomfort. A request for acknowledgement was simultaneously the simplest and most complicated thing Sarah could have asked for. Simple because it costs nothing material. Complicated because acknowledgement meant bringing Andrew's past mistakes back into public view, meant adding another chapter to his troubled legacy, meant forcing conversations the family had spent years trying to avoid. Charles made his decision with the pragmatism of a king who understood that trying to hide truth in the age of DNA testing and social media was futile. We acknowledge her. We issue a statement that's honest about the circumstances, respectful to everyone involved, and makes clear that while Sarah is Andrew's biological daughter, she has no formal role in the royal family. We don't offer money to buy her silence because that implies we're ashamed of her existence. We treat her with the dignity any person deserves, and we let Andrew handle the personal relationship however he chooses or doesn't choose. The communications director began drafting the statement immediately, knowing they had perhaps 36 hours before Sarah's lawyers made their move. Every word would be scrutinized, every phrase analyzed for hidden meaning. The statement had to be factual without being cold, acknowledge without embracing scandal, honest without providing ammunition for critics who already questioned the monarchy's place in modern society. Meanwhile, at Royal Lodge, Andrew sat alone in the library that had once belonged to the Queen Mother, surrounded by family photographs that now felt like accusations. His 2 daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, both grown women with their own families, stared at him from silver frames on the mantelpiece. They didn't know they had a half-sister. His ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, still his closest confidant despite their divorce decades earlier, didn't know. His late mother, who'd protected him through every scandal with fierce maternal loyalty, had died without knowing she had another granddaughter. The secret had been kept so long it had almost stopped being real, had become something that happened to someone else in another lifetime. Except now, science had made it undeniably, permanently real, and there would be no more pretending it away. Andrew picked up his phone 3 times to call his daughters, to warn them before the palace announcement was made public, to try to explain how a brief relationship 38 years ago had produced a child he'd never known about. 3 times he put the phone down without dialing, unable to find words that would make this acceptable, that would justify why he'd never tried harder to verify whether Catherine's letter, if it had reached him, might have contained information he needed to know. The truth, uncomfortable and unavoidable, was that Andrew had lived his entire adult life with a sense of entitlement that made him careless about consequences, and now those consequences had manifested in the form of a daughter who deserved better than the father she'd been given. The statement was finalized at 2 in the morning, reviewed by lawyers, approved by Charles, and scheduled for release at 9 the next morning to coincide with the start of the news cycle. 53 words that would change Sarah Mitchell's life forever and add another complicated chapter to the House of Windsor's already complicated history. Buckingham Palace can confirm that DNA testing has established Prince Andrew, Duke of York, as the biological father of Miss Sarah Mitchell. Miss Mitchell was born in 1987 from a relationship predating the Duke's marriage. She has no formal role within the royal family. The Duke respects her privacy and wishes her well. At 8:59 on Wednesday morning, the statement went live across every platform the monarchy controlled. By 9:15, it was international news. By 9:30, Sarah Mitchell's quiet life as a history teacher in Manchester was over, replaced by something she'd never asked for. Being the secret daughter of a disgraced prince, the living evidence of mistakes made before she was born, the unwanted proof that even royal blood doesn't guarantee royal treatment. The past unburied. Catherine Mitchell had been beautiful in the way that turns heads but doesn't quite reach the level of intimidating, approachable enough that a young naval officer felt confident striking up conversation at a pub near the Portsmouth Naval Base in April of 1986. She was 23, working as a civilian secretary in the base administration office, living in a small flat she shared with two other women, saving money for a trip to Italy she'd been planning since finishing university. Andrew was 26, between deployments, enjoying the relative freedom that came with being third in line to the throne instead of first, not yet married to Sarah Ferguson, though the engagement would be announced within months. He introduced himself as Andy, not mentioning the prince part, and Catherine didn't recognize him without the formal uniforms and official photographs that usually accompanied his public appearances. The affair ended the way such relationships often do, not with dramatic confrontation but with gradual distance. Andrew's deployment schedule changed. Phone calls became less frequent. Catherine sensed the shift before he said anything explicit, the way he stopped making plans beyond the immediate future, the way conversations became shorter and less personal. When she discovered she was pregnant 6 weeks after their last meeting, Catherine faced a decision that would define the rest of her life. She could try to contact Andrew, force him to acknowledge the situation, potentially receive financial support, but almost certainly face scrutiny and judgment from the press and public. Or she could handle it privately, raise the child without royal involvement, protect her daughter from the complications that would come with having a prince for a father who hadn't chosen to be one. Catherine chose privacy. She wrote one letter, addressed to Andrew at the palace, explaining the situation and providing her contact information. The letter was logged by palace staff, filed with hundreds of other pieces of correspondence that claimed royal connections or requested assistance, and deemed insufficiently credible to warrant forwarding to Andrew himself. Standard protocol for managing the volume of communication received by royal family members, sensible in most cases, catastrophic in this one. Catherine never received a response. She interpreted the silence as rejection, as confirmation that whatever she'd thought existed between them had been one-sided, a brief amusement for a prince who'd moved on to more suitable company. She stopped trying to make contact, focused instead on preparing for single motherhood in an era when that status still carried social stigma. Sarah was born on the 15th of January, 1987. Delivered at a Manchester hospital where Catherine had moved to be closer to her family. The birth certificate listed only Catherine's name in the father's field, a blank space that would define Sarah's childhood questions about where she came from, who she looked like, whether the man in Catherine's few carefully preserved photographs had loved them both, or just forgotten them. Catherine provided the minimum information required, telling Sarah that her father was someone she dated briefly who wasn't ready for the responsibility of parenthood. A common enough story, sad but not unusual. The kind of family situation that exists in millions of households where biology and parenting don't always align. Catherine married when Sarah was 5 years old, a kind man named Robert Mitchell who worked as an accountant and had no desire to be anyone other than who he was. He adopted Sarah, gave her his surname, raised her as his own daughter with genuine affection that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with daily presence. Sarah grew up knowing Robert as her father, the man who attended school plays and helped with homework and taught her to ride a bicycle in the park near their house. The question of her biological father became less urgent as she got older, something she thought about occasionally but didn't obsess over, accepting that some questions might never have answers. Catherine's cancer diagnosis came suddenly, aggressively, the kind that moves faster than treatment can manage. She had 6 months from diagnosis to death, time that Catherine used to organize her affairs and have conversations she'd been postponing for decades. In her final weeks, confined to a hospice bed with morphine managing pain that had become unbearable, Catherine told Sarah about the diary hidden in the attic of Robert's house, about the photographs stored in a box marked University Memories, about the letter she'd written to a palace that never responded. "I need you to know where you come from," Catherine said, her voice thin with exhaustion. "Not because it changes who you are, but because you deserve to know the truth. Your father's name is Andrew, Prince Andrew. I loved him briefly and he never knew about you. That wasn't his choice, but it also wasn't entirely not his choice. He could have tried harder to make sure messages reached him. I could have tried harder to make contact. We both failed you in different ways." Sarah processed this information with the surreal detachment of someone receiving life-changing news while simultaneously watching their mother die. The revelation about her biological father seemed less important than the reality of imminent loss, less urgent than making sure Catherine was comfortable and knew she was loved. But after the funeral, after the grief settled into something more manageable, Sarah retrieved the diary from the attic and read her mother's account of those 3 months in 1986. Catherine had written with the careful detail of someone who knew these memories would be important eventually, describing conversations and dates and private jokes that painted a picture of genuine connection, however brief. The photographs showed a young woman and a young man looking at each other with unmistakable affection, captured in moments before they knew their relationship would produce a child neither was prepared for. Sarah spent months debating what to do with this information. She researched Prince Andrew, learning about his public life, his marriage and divorce, his 2 daughters who would be her half-sisters if Catherine's story was true. She watched interviews, read articles, formed opinions about a man she'd never met, but who was supposedly half responsible for her existence. The more she learned about Andrew's scandals, particularly the allegations and associations that had destroyed his public role, the less certain she became about whether establishing connection was wise. But the question wasn't whether Andrew was someone she wanted as a father. The question was whether she deserved acknowledgement of the truth, whether being his daughter meant something regardless of his character or her feelings about him. The decision to pursue legal acknowledgement came after long conversations with Robert, the only father she'd ever really known, who told her he would support whatever choice she made but reminded her that legal acknowledgement and personal relationship were separate things. "You can establish the biological fact without obligating yourself to anything beyond that," he said. "You're not asking for money or titles, you're asking for the truth. There's dignity in that, regardless of how they respond." Sarah hired lawyers, submitted her claim through proper channels, provided the diary excerpts and photographs as supporting evidence, and requested DNA testing to establish biological paternity beyond reasonable doubt. The process took 3 months, during which Sarah continued teaching history to teenagers who had no idea their teacher was waiting to learn if she was really a princess's secret half-sister. The day the DNA results were confirmed, Sarah sat in her small flat in Manchester, staring at the official letter from the laboratory, reading the percentages that transformed her from someone with a family story into someone with a legally verifiable royal connection. 99.97% probability of paternity. Scientific certainty expressed in numbers that left no room for continued denial. She was Prince Andrew's daughter. That fact was now established, documented, impossible to dismiss. What came next depended on how the palace chose to respond, whether they would acknowledge her with dignity or try to minimize her existence to protect an institution that had already failed her once when they didn't forward her mother's letter 37 years ago. Sarah didn't want money. She didn't want public attention. She wanted what every person deserves: acknowledgement of truth, recognition that she existed, and perhaps, though she tried not to hope for this too strongly, the chance to know her half-sisters who had grown up with the father she'd never had. The family fracture. Princess Beatrice learned about her half-sister through a phone call from her father at 7 in the morning, 3 hours before the palace statement would make the news public. She was at her home in the Cotswolds preparing breakfast for her young daughter when Andrew's name appeared on her phone screen. The call itself was unusual. Her father rarely contacted her this early, rarely contacted her at all recently given the distance that had developed between them after his scandals made family association complicated. "I need to tell you something before it becomes public," Andrew began without greeting or preamble. "DNA tests have confirmed I have another daughter. Her name is Sarah. She's 37. Her mother was someone I knew briefly before I married your mother. The palace is releasing a statement in 3 hours." Beatrice set down the coffee pot she'd been holding, feeling the kitchen tilt slightly as information processed. A half-sister. A woman her age whose existence had been hidden, not through conspiracy but through the simple failure of a letter to reach its destination. "Does Eugenie know?" Beatrice asked, her mind immediately jumping to her younger sister, to how this news would affect their family dynamic. "I'm calling her next. I wanted to tell you both before the statement goes public. I'm sorry you're finding out this way. I'm sorry about all of it." The apology felt inadequate, a small word for a large situation, but Beatrice appreciated the attempt, even as she struggled to formulate a response. "What's she like? Have you met her?" "I haven't met her. She approached the palace 3 months ago, requesting acknowledgement. We did DNA testing. The results are conclusive. She's my daughter, which makes her your half-sister." Eugenie received the same call 20 minutes later while at her home in London, her reaction similar to her sister's: shock, confusion, and beneath those immediate responses, a complicated curiosity about the woman who shared their father, despite never sharing their childhood. The two sisters connected by phone within an hour, processing the information together in the way they'd learned to handle family complications, united in their response even when they disagreed about details. "We need to meet her," Eugenie said firmly. "Not for Dad, not for the palace. For us. She's our sister." Beatrice agreed, though with more caution. "If she wants to meet us, she didn't ask for this attention. We need to respect whatever boundaries she sets." The palace statement released at 9 created exactly the media storm communications staff had anticipated. News networks interrupted regular programming. Social media erupted with commentary ranging from genuine sympathy for Sarah to harsh criticism of Andrew to conspiracy theories about whether there might be other secret royal children waiting to be discovered. Photographs of Sarah, extracted from her social media accounts before she could make them private, were circulated widely, analyzed for resemblances to Andrew and her half-sisters. Reporters descended on the Manchester school where she taught, hoping for comment or interview, creating chaos that forced administrators to send students home and close the building until media attention subsided. Sarah spent that first day in hiding at a friend's house, watching her life become public spectacle, reading commentary from strangers who felt entitled to opinions about her character, her motives, her appearance, her decision to pursue acknowledgement. The experience was violating in ways she hadn't fully anticipated, making her question whether establishing truth had been worth this invasion of privacy. But beneath the discomfort and anger, Sarah felt something else: validation. The palace had acknowledged her. Her father had, through official channels, if not personal contact, admitted she existed. The secret that had defined her mother's silence and her own uncertainty was now public fact. She was Andrew's daughter, recognized by the institution that had ignored her mother's letter decades earlier. At Royal Lodge, Andrew endured the aftermath alone, having declined Sarah Ferguson's offer to stay with him through what she accurately predicted would be a difficult period. His ex-wife had been surprisingly understanding when he'd told her about the DNA results, responding not with anger but with pragmatic observation that mistakes made before their marriage couldn't be held against him now, though his failure to try harder to verify whether. Catherine's letter had reached him and showed the same carelessness that had characterized too many of his decisions. "You need to meet her," Fergie had said firmly. "Not because the palace says you should or because the media is watching. Because she's your daughter and she deserves better than official statements and legal acknowledgments. She deserves a father, even if you're not particularly good at being one." Andrew knew she was right, but found himself paralyzed by uncertainty about what meeting Sarah would accomplish. What could he offer her beyond the acknowledgement she'd already received? He couldn't give her back the childhood she'd spent without him. He couldn't make up for Catherine's unanswered letter, or the decades Sarah had lived not knowing where she came from. He was, by any honest assessment, a poor father, even to the daughters he'd raised from birth. His attention sporadic, his judgment questionable, his priorities often focused on himself rather than their needs. What made him think he could establish a meaningful relationship with a 37-year-old woman who had every reason to resent his absence from her life? King Charles addressed the situation in a private conversation with William and Kate, seeking their perspective on how to handle the expanding implications. Sarah's existence raised questions about family gatherings, about whether she would be included in Christmas celebrations or milestone events, about what her relationship to the wider family should look like given that she had no formal royal role. "She's family," William said simply. "Biology makes her family regardless of legal status or public role. Whether she wants a relationship with us is her choice, but we should make clear she's welcome to know her relatives if that's what she wants." Kate added practical observation. "The public will watch how we handle this. If we exclude her, we look cold and elitist. If we embrace her too enthusiastically, we risk seeming like we're using her to rehabilitate Andrew's image. The balance is letting her set the pace, responding to whatever level of connection she seeks." 2 weeks after the palace statement, Beatrice sent a carefully worded letter to Sarah's lawyers, requesting the opportunity to meet privately without media attention or palace officials present. "I would very much like to know my half-sister," Beatrice wrote, "not because the situation requires it or because the palace thinks it's appropriate, but because you're my sister and I've spent my entire life with only one sibling. I understand if you're not ready for that connection, and I respect whatever boundaries you need. But if you're willing, I would like to meet you somewhere quiet where we can talk as sisters rather than as public figures." Eugenie sent a similar letter, slightly less formal, including her personal phone number and an invitation to call if Sarah preferred speaking directly rather than communicating through lawyers. Sarah received both letters on the same day, reading them repeatedly, touched by the genuine warmth that came through despite the formal phrasing. Her half-sisters wanted to know her. They were reaching out not because protocol demanded it, but because they recognized a connection that transcended scandal and complicated circumstances. Sarah debated with Robert, with close friends, with the lawyer who'd guided her through the acknowledgement process. Meeting Beatrice and Eugenie meant stepping further into the world she'd only glimpsed from outside, meant accepting that being Andrew's daughter came with connections beyond just him. But it also meant the possibility of a relationship with women who shared her father, who might understand in ways no one else could what it meant to navigate the complications of royal blood. She agreed to meet them 3 weeks after receiving their letters at a private location arranged by palace staff who understood the need for absolute discretion. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at a friend's cottage in the countryside, far from London, away from photographers who'd continued trying to capture images of the three half-sisters together. Sarah arrived first, nervous in ways she hadn't been since childhood, questioning every decision from what to wear to whether meeting at all was wise. Beatrice and Eugenie arrived together, clearly as nervous as Sarah, the three women standing in an elegant drawing room looking at each other with unmistakable resemblance. Same bone structure, same coloring, same genetic inheritance from the man who'd fathered them all under very different circumstances. "You look like us," Beatrice said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "I mean, obviously you look like us, DNA and everything, but it's still strange to see it in person." Sarah laughed, tension breaking slightly. "I had the same thought. I've been staring at your pictures online for months, but seeing you in person is different." They talked for 4 hours that first meeting, conversation flowing more easily than any of them had anticipated, covering everything from childhood memories to current lives to complicated feelings about their shared father. Beatrice and Eugenie were honest about Andrew's failings, about the distance that had grown between them after his scandals, about their own struggles with being his daughters in the public eye. Sarah was honest about growing up without him, about learning his identity only after her mother's death, about her decision to pursue acknowledgement despite knowing it would make her life more complicated. "Do you want to meet him?" Eugenie asked eventually, the question all three had been avoiding. Sarah considered carefully before answering. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should, that I need to see him in person to make this real. But another part thinks meeting him would be disappointing in ways that official acknowledgement isn't. He's not who I imagined when I was a child wondering about my father. He's someone complicated and flawed, and I'm not sure what we would say to each other." Beatrice nodded, understanding. "He's difficult to love even when you've known him your whole life. I can't imagine how much more difficult it would be coming from your position. Whatever you decide, we support it. You don't owe him a relationship just because he's your father biologically." The three sisters parted that evening with plans to meet again, with exchanged phone numbers and tentative friendship that might, with time, develop into something deeper. Sarah drove back to Manchester feeling something she hadn't expected: belonging. Not to the royal family as an institution, but to these two women who shared her blood and understood better than anyone else could what it meant to be Andrew's daughter. The complications remained. The media attention continued. The questions about Sarah's place in the family structure persisted. But for the first time since discovering her mother's diary, Sarah felt less like an outsider looking in and more like someone who might eventually find her place in the complicated family she'd never known she had. The confrontations. Andrew received a letter from Sarah 6 weeks after the palace statement, delivered through her lawyers to Royal Lodge, 3 handwritten pages that he read standing in his library, unable to sit still while absorbing her words. She wrote with clarity that made him uncomfortable, describing her childhood wondering about her father, her mother's reluctance to speak about him, her discovery of the truth only after Catherine's death. She explained her decision to pursue legal acknowledgement, emphasizing she'd never wanted money or titles, only recognition of truth. And then in the final paragraph, she wrote the words he'd been dreading. "I think we should meet, not because I need a father at 37 years old. I don't. Robert fulfilled that role better than you could have, and I'm grateful for the life my mother built without your involvement. But I need to see you in person, to understand who you are beyond photographs and news articles, to decide for myself what role, if any, you might have in my life going forward." The meeting was arranged for a Saturday morning in early November at Buckingham Palace, in one of the smaller private sitting rooms where family discussions happened away from staff and officials. The palace insisted on the location, arguing it provided security and privacy impossible to guarantee elsewhere, though Andrew suspected they also wanted control over the meeting and wanted witnesses in adjacent rooms who could confirm what was said if disputes arose later. Sarah agreed to the location, bringing only her lawyer for support, declining offers from Beatrice and Eugenie to accompany her, insisting this conversation needed to happen between daughter and father without other family members mediating or buffering. Andrew arrived 30 minutes early, pacing the sitting room, rehearsing possible openings that all sounded inadequate. How do you begin conversation with a daughter you've never met, whose existence you'd denied until science made denial impossible? What words existed that could span 37 years of absence, that could acknowledge failure without making excuses, that could express regret while respecting the life she'd built without him? Sarah arrived precisely on time, escorted by palace staff to the sitting room where Andrew waited, her lawyer remaining outside to give them privacy. She wore simple clothing, no jewelry, nothing that suggested she'd dressed to impress or intimidate. She looked, Andrew thought with uncomfortable recognition, exactly like his own daughters had looked at that age. The family resemblance unmistakable even to someone determined to deny it. "Hello," Sarah said simply, standing in the doorway with neither warmth nor hostility, her tone carefully neutral. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Andrew gestured to the chairs arranged near the fireplace, a traditional meeting setup for private palace conversations. "Thank you for coming. I imagine this isn't easy." "Nothing about this situation has been easy," Sarah replied, sitting with a straight posture that reminded Andrew of his mother, that same quality of controlled composure under difficult circumstances. But necessary things rarely are. They sat in silence for a moment, each waiting for the other to speak first, until Andrew realized the burden of beginning fell to him, the parent meeting the child, the person whose actions or failures to act had created this situation. "I want you to know I never received your mother's letter," Andrew began, the explanation he'd been preparing. "I'm not making excuses. If I'd tried harder to ensure personal correspondence reached me, rather than being filtered by staff, the letter might have. But I didn't receive it, and I didn't know you existed until your lawyers contacted the palace 3 months ago." Sarah nodded slowly. "I believe you didn't receive the letter. I don't think you conspired to hide my existence or deliberately ignored my mother's attempts at contact, but I also think you could have tried harder to make sure important messages reached you. You were old enough at 26 to understand that relationships have consequences. You chose to rely on systems that filtered out those consequences, and that was a choice, even if it wasn't a conscious one." The accusation landed cleanly, cutting through the explanations Andrew had prepared. She was right. He'd lived his entire adult life insulated by protocol and staff, by systems designed to protect him from inconvenience and unwanted complications. Those systems had served him well in many ways, and had shielded him from endless demands on his time and attention. But they'd also shielded him from information he should have received, from responsibilities he should have accepted, from the reality that his actions affected people beyond himself. "You're right," Andrew said finally, the admission harder than he'd expected. "I was careless in ways that affected you and your mother. I'm sorry for that. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am sorry." Sarah absorbed the apology without visible reaction, her expression maintaining the same careful neutrality. "What would you have done if you'd received the letter? If you'd known my mother was pregnant?" Andrew considered lying, offering the response that would reflect well on his character, claiming he would have stepped up and taken responsibility. But Sarah deserved honesty, even if honesty revealed him to be less than she might have hoped. "I don't know," he admitted. "I want to say I would have done the right thing, but I was 26 years old, about to be engaged to someone else, not particularly mature or thoughtful about consequences. I might have offered financial support. I probably wouldn't have sought active involvement in your life. I certainly wouldn't have tried to establish the kind of father-daughter relationship you deserved. I was too selfish, too focused on my own priorities to be a good father, even to the daughters I had later." "At least you're honest about it," Sarah said, something that might have been respect flickering across her features. "Most people in your position would claim they would have been different, better, more responsible. You're admitting you wouldn't have been—" "I wasn't a good person then," Andrew replied. "I'm not sure I'm a particularly good person now, but I am trying to be honest about who I was and what I would have done, because you deserve that much at minimum." They talked for 2 hours, conversation moving from past to present, from blame to understanding, from anger to something more complicated than anger. Sarah described her childhood with Robert as her father, the good life her mother had built despite difficult circumstances, and her career teaching history to teenagers who had no interest in kings and queens except as exam topics. Andrew described his own failures as a father to Beatrice and Eugenie, his scandals that had destroyed his public role, and his current life in relative seclusion at Royal Lodge. "Why did you want to meet me?" Andrew asked eventually. "You said in your letter you didn't need a father, so why put yourself through this?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Because I needed to see you as a real person rather than an idea. When I was a child, I imagined my father as someone perfect, someone who would have been wonderful if only circumstances had been different. After I learned who you were, I imagined you as completely terrible, someone who didn't deserve acknowledgement or forgiveness. Both versions were fantasy. I needed to meet you to see who you actually are, flaws and honesty and complicated reality, so I could stop wondering and start knowing." "And now that you know?" Andrew asked. "Now I know you're just a person, not a fairy tale father or a complete villain, just someone who made mistakes and failed to take responsibility for consequences, until forced to by DNA tests. I don't think we'll have a close relationship. I don't think I need you in my life in the way daughters typically need fathers. But I'm glad I know the truth. I'm glad you acknowledged me. And I'm glad I met Beatrice and Eugenie, because they're good people despite having you as a father, which suggests there's hope for complicated families." Andrew laughed despite himself, a short sound that carried genuine amusement. "That might be the most honest assessment anyone's given me. You're definitely my daughter. You have the Windsor directness." The aftermath. 6 months after the palace statement, Sarah Mitchell had built a life that balanced her newfound royal connection with the normal existence she'd always wanted. She'd returned to teaching, though at a different school where students and staff didn't know her history and could treat her as simply Miss Mitchell, the history teacher who made even the tutors interesting. She'd moved from her Manchester flat to a small cottage in the countryside, purchased with money from a book deal she'd initially refused, but eventually accepted after her lawyer pointed out financial security would give her freedom to ignore future offers she found distasteful. The book, when published, would be a thoughtful memoir about discovering royal paternity as an adult, about complicated families and genetic inheritance, and the difference between biological fathers and men who actually parent their children. Her relationship with Beatrice and Eugenie had developed into a genuine friendship, the three sisters meeting monthly for private dinners where they talked about everything except the royal family, deliberately creating space where Sarah could be simply herself rather than Andrew's secret daughter made public. Beatrice's children called her Aunt Sarah, a title she cherished more than any formal recognition the palace might offer. Eugenie had introduced her to a wide social circle of people who treated her with normal curiosity about her background, but didn't make it the defining feature of how they saw her. For the first time since the DNA results became public, Sarah felt less like a scandal and more like a person who'd gained unexpected relatives she was learning to appreciate. Her relationship with Andrew remained distant but cordial, limited to occasional emails and one additional meeting at Christmas when Sarah had attended a private family gathering at Beatrice's home, not at Andrew's invitation but at his daughter's insistence that she should be included. The meeting had been awkward but not hostile. Andrew clearly unsure how to interact with her in a family setting, Sarah equally uncertain what role he should play in her life beyond being a biological contributor. They'd settled into cautious acknowledgement, greeting each other politely, avoiding deep conversation, accepting that their connection was primarily through Beatrice and Eugenie rather than direct father-daughter relationship. It wasn't the reconciliation some had hoped for or the dramatic rejection others had expected, simply two people navigating complicated circumstances with honesty about their limitations. The public's fascination with Sarah's story had faded with time, replaced by newer scandals and fresher royal drama, though articles still appeared occasionally analyzing what her existence meant for the monarchy's image or speculating about whether other secret royal children might be waiting to come forward. Sarah had learned to ignore most commentary, focusing instead on the relationships that mattered. Her half-sisters, her adoptive father Robert, who remained her real dad regardless of DNA results, her students who needed her attention more than tabloids deserved her response. She'd given one carefully controlled interview to a respected journalist, primarily to stop endless media requests, speaking honestly about her mother's life, her own journey to discovering truth, and her current relationship with the family who'd acknowledged her too late to change the past, but not too late to affect the future. King Charles had handled the situation with careful pragmatism, ensuring Sarah was included in extended family gatherings when she chose to attend, making clear through private communications that she was welcome in family spaces, even if she held no formal royal role. He'd met her twice, treating her with the same polite interest he showed to his other relatives by marriage or distant connection, neither embracing her as central family member nor excluding her as an embarrassing reminder of Andrew's failures. It was, in Charles's view, the appropriate balance, acknowledging biological fact while respecting Sarah's desire for normal life, demonstrating that the monarchy could adapt to complicated truths without either denying them or being defined by them. The situation had prompted quiet discussions within palace walls about protocols for handling similar situations in the future, about ensuring correspondence claiming significant information actually reached intended recipients rather than being filtered out by overzealous staff. Legal experts had updated guidelines about DNA testing and acknowledgement procedures, creating clear pathways for people who believed they had royal biological connections to pursue verification without the complications Sarah had faced. It was, in a small way, progress, the institution learning from its failures, updating systems that had allowed important letters to go unanswered and people to go unacknowledged for decades. For Sarah, the aftermath had brought unexpected peace. The question that had haunted her since finding her mother's diary had been answered definitively. Yes, she was Andrew's daughter, and yes, the palace had acknowledged that fact. What happened next was in her control, not determined by protocol or public opinion, but by her own choices about what role royal connection should play in her life. She'd chosen limited engagement, selective relationships, careful boundaries between the public figure she'd briefly become and the private person she wanted to remain. It was working, slowly building a life that honored both her mother's sacrifice and her own need for normalcy, accepting complicated family history without being defined by it. One evening in late spring, Sarah sat in her cottage garden, grading student essays about whether Henry VIII deserved his reputation as England's worst king, when her phone buzzed with a text from Eugenie. "Family photo for grandmother's memorial. Please come if you can. Dress code formal, but not ridiculous." Sarah smiled at the phrasing, so typical of Eugenie's approach to royal obligation, making requirements sound less intimidating by acknowledging their absurdity. She texted back agreement to attend, knowing her presence in an official family photograph would generate headlines about acceptance and inclusion, but also knowing she owed it to her half-sisters who'd welcomed her without hesitation, who'd chosen relationship over institutional convenience. The photograph session happened 2 weeks later at Windsor Castle, Sarah standing slightly to the side in the large group portrait, not central but not hidden either, positioned between Beatrice and Eugenie with Beatrice's hand resting lightly on her shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. Andrew stood several people away, maintaining the physical distance that reflected their emotional reality, his expression neutral in that way he'd perfected for decades of photographs where internal feelings couldn't show. When the photograph was released to the media, commentary focused predictably on Sarah's inclusion, on what it meant for the family to publicly acknowledge her presence, on whether this represented real acceptance or calculated image management. Sarah read the commentary with detached amusement, understanding that public interpretation would always miss the private reality, that she was in the photograph because her sisters had asked her to be. After all, she was family regardless of complicated circumstances. After all, sometimes institutions adapted when the people within them insisted on doing the right thing despite difficulty. The monarchy would survive this minor adjustment to its public face. Andrew would continue his life in relative seclusion, his legacy permanently marked by scandals, including the daughter he'd never known until DNA testing made ignorance impossible. And Sarah would return to her cottage, to her students and her quiet life, carrying royal blood that mattered less than daily kindness and genuine connection with people who chose to know her, not because of her father, but despite all. When DNA reveals what letters couldn't confirm, even palaces must acknowledge truth. Sarah Mitchell's journey from secret daughter to accepted family member reminds us that biology doesn't guarantee belonging, but honesty might. What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more royal stories where human truth matters more than crown protocol. Share your thoughts below.